The morning fog still clung to Fort Bragg like a secret it wasn't ready to give up. It rolled low across the training grounds, curled around the base of the flagpole, and pressed itself against the steel doors of Unit 7's barracks as though even the weather understood that what was inside was not meant to be disturbed. The sun hadn't fully committed to rising yet. The sky was the color of old steel, gray, flat, and indifferent. It was 5:30 hours when Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez stepped out of the transport vehicle and stood for a moment on the gravel path, taking in the compound with the quiet, measuring eyes of someone who had learned long ago never to enter any space without first understanding it. She was not what people expected when they imagined a Unit 7 operator. She wasn't towering. She wasn't broad. She stood 5'7" in her boots, lean and straight-backed, with dark hair pulled tight beneath her patrol cap and a face that gave nothing away, not nervousness, not eagerness, not the forced confidence of someone trying to prove something. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that isn't practiced but earned, the kind that comes from having already survived rooms far more dangerous than this one. She carried one bag. Standard issue, nothing personal attached to the outside of it. No patches, no pins, no small personalized details that most soldiers use to mark themselves in a world of uniforms. Just a bag, a name, and a set of orders that had placed her here. She pushed through the steel doors. The barracks of Unit 7 were exactly what she had expected, functional, lived in, heavy with the particular atmosphere of men who had spent too much time in close quarters with each other, and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. Gear hung from every available surface. The smell of gun oil, boot polish, and stale coffee was so embedded in the walls it had practically become structural. There were 12 men in various states of morning preparation when she walked in. Some were lacing boots. Some were running through equipment checks. A few were seated at the long center table with coffee mugs, talking in low tones about nothing important. The talking stopped. It didn't fade, it stopped, all at once like a switch thrown. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and in the space of about 3 seconds, Elena watched the room go through a very specific and very familiar sequence of reactions. First, surprise, then confusion, then the slow, ugly settling of something colder. Sergeant First Class Doyle was the one who named it out loud. He was seated at the head of the center table, the natural gravitational center of the room, the way certain men always manage to position themselves without appearing to try. He was big, not just tall but constructed, the kind of physical presence that had probably opened every door he'd ever walked through before he even reached for the handle. He had a face that had been rearranged by conflict more than once and wore it like a credential. He looked at Elena the way a man looks at something he's already decided doesn't belong. "You sure you didn't take a wrong turn, sweetheart?" The words were lazy, almost bored, which made them worse. Casual cruelty always did more damage than the angry kind. A few men laughed, not all of them, but enough. Elena let the words land. She didn't deflect them, didn't flinch from them, didn't rush to respond to them. She simply let them exist in the air between her and Doyle for a long, deliberate moment, long enough that the laughter began to feel slightly less comfortable than it had a second ago. Then she turned away from him entirely. She walked to the empty bunk at the far end of the room, the one that had clearly been left for her, positioned as far from the center of everything as possible, a small architectural message that she noted and filed away, and she began unpacking with quiet, methodical precision. Uniform folded, boots placed side by side, personal kit arranged in the order she always arranged it, the order that had become muscle memory across more deployments than she was authorized to count. Behind her, the room slowly came back to life. The conversations resumed, quieter now, laced with glances thrown in her direction. She felt each one land on her back like a fingertip pressing on a bruise. She was meant to feel them. That was the point. She felt them and kept moving. Because Elena Vasquez had learned something about rooms like this one, rooms full of people who had already decided she was less than them before she'd spoken a single word. She had learned that the only argument worth making in those rooms was the one you made without opening your mouth. You didn't speak your way into respect in a place like Unit 7. You endured your way in. You performed your way in. You outlasted every test they constructed, every boundary they pushed, every small cruelty they deployed. And eventually, not quickly, not easily, but eventually, the room had no choice but to recalibrate. She had done it before, in places harder than this, against men who made Doyle look patient. She finished unpacking, straightened up, and turned to face the room. Nobody was openly watching her anymore, but nobody had stopped. She picked up her weapon, checked the chamber with the automatic habit of someone who had been trained past the point of thought, and walked toward the door to report for first duty. She paused at the threshold, just for a second, facing away from the room. Her jaw tightened just slightly, just once. Then she stepped through the door and into the gray morning, and the steel closed behind her, and she walked toward whatever came next with the same steady, unhurried step she had carried through every hard thing that had come before it. The men she left behind didn't know her name yet, not really. They thought they did. They thought they'd read her in 3 seconds from across a barracks room and understood everything they needed to. They were wrong. But they wouldn't find that out today. Today, Elena Vasquez simply reported for duty. And that, for now, was enough. The second day at Fort Bragg began before the sun had any right to be up. Elena was already awake when the lights snapped on at 4:45 hours, had been awake for 20 minutes before that, lying still in her bunk with her eyes open, and her mind running through everything she had observed in the first 24 hours the way a mechanic runs through an engine before a long drive. Cataloging, assessing, preparing. She already knew what was coming. She had seen it before, the particular playbook that men like Doyle ran when they wanted someone gone without leaving fingerprints on the exit. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was small, deliberate, and relentless. The kind of campaign designed to make the target feel isolated, incompetent, and eventually invisible. The kind of pressure that didn't leave marks but left people. She swung her legs off the bunk, planted her boots on the floor, and stood up. The games had already started before breakfast. When Elena reached her gear rack for the pre-dawn equipment check, her tactical vest was hanging in the wrong position, shifted 2 spaces to the left, her name tag facing inward. A small thing, easy to miss, easy to dismiss as an accident. But Elena had hung it herself the night before, and she had a memory for the exact placement of everything she owned that went beyond habit into something closer to survival instinct. She checked the vest. The shoulder strap had been partially loosened, not all the way, not enough to be immediately visible, but enough that under physical stress, under the weight of a full combat load, it would fail. It would fail at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the way that looked like operator error. She tightened it without a word, without looking around the room to identify who had done it. Her water canteen had been swapped for an empty one. Her energy rations were missing from her side pouch. She replaced what she could from her personal reserves, reported for equipment check with everything in order, and said nothing to no one. Doyle watched her from across the bay with the patient expression of a man waiting for a reaction that never came. His eyes narrowed slightly when she fell into formation without complaint. He had expected at least a flicker of frustration, a question, a search, something he could point to. She gave him nothing. Physical training began at 5:30, and it was immediately clear that the session Doyle had designed for the morning was not a standard Unit 7 workout. He had restructured it entirely, and the men who had been briefed the night before moved through the warm-up with the slightly too casual energy of people who already knew what was coming and were looking forward to watching someone else suffer it. Double sprints on the back hill, weighted carries across the full length of the training ground, Back-to-back obstacle runs in full kit under a Carolina summer sun that had decided, as though personally recruited by Doyle, to show up early and merciless. It was designed with one purpose: to break Alina publicly, visibly, in front of every man in the unit, and to give the breakdown an audience large enough that she could never pretend it hadn't happened. She ran the first sprint and came in mid-pack. She ran the second and moved up. The weighted carry was brutal. A sandbag loaded to regulation combat weight across a quarter-mile of uneven terrain. 3 men dropped their bags briefly to adjust grip. 2 fell behind the pace line. Alina carried hers the entire distance without adjustment, without slowing, with the particular mechanical endurance of someone who had trained under conditions that made this feel almost familiar. By the third obstacle run, the dynamic had shifted. It was subtle, the way important shifts always are at first. A few of the men who had been watching her with contemptuous expectation had gone quiet. The laughter that had punctuated the early sets had faded. In its place was something more complicated, the specific discomfort of people whose predictions are failing in real time. Martinez noticed it first. He ran beside Alina on the final approach to the obstacle course and watched her move with the focused efficiency of someone who wasn't performing for anyone, who simply knew how to do this, deeply and completely, the way only real experience teaches a body to move. He said nothing, but he stopped smiling. The final element of the session was a 2-mile weighted run, full kit, no exceptions, timed from the first step to the last. It was the kind of finish designed to destroy whatever was left after everything that came before it. Most of the squad was already burning through their reserves. Legs were heavy. Lungs were raw. Alina ran it like she was saving something for later. She crossed the finish line second, just behind Martinez, who had spent 4 years as a competitive distance runner before the army became his life and the track became a memory. He was breathing hard when she pulled up beside him. She was breathing hard too. She was human, not a machine. But there was a control to it, a management of effort that told its own story to anyone paying attention. Martinez turned and looked at her for a moment, really looked. The way soldiers look at each other when the pretense has been burned away by shared physical suffering, and what's left is just the truth of what a person is made of. He gave a single nod, small, involuntary, the kind a person gives before they've decided to give it. Alina met his eyes briefly, then looked forward. Doyle stood at the edge of the finish line with his arms crossed, and an expression that had curdled somewhere between frustration and cold recalibration. He had not gotten what he came for this morning. Alina had not faltered, had not complained, had not given anyone a single frame of footage he could use against her. He needed a different approach. That evening, the note appeared on her locker. She found it after evening chow, a folded piece of paper tucked into the latch. She opened it, read it once and didn't read it again. The words were designed to find the deepest, softest point of a person and press hard, personal, specific, the kind of cruelty that requires research or rumor or both. Whoever wrote it had put thought into it, had wanted it to land in a place that training couldn't armor. Alina stood in front of her locker for 3 full seconds. Then she folded the note into a perfect square with the careful precision she applied to everything, and she placed it into the breast pocket of her jacket. Not to report it, not to use it, just to keep it, the way soldiers keep certain things, not because they want to, but because discarding them feels like letting someone else decide what matters. She closed her locker, sat on her bunk, and cleaned her weapon in the quiet of the evening barracks. Around her, the unit moved through its nighttime routines, loud, loose, deliberately indifferent to her presence. She was the ghost in the room, the variable they hadn't accounted for and couldn't yet explain. She cleaned each component of her rifle with the slow, meditative focus of someone who had learned that the space between action and rest was not dead time, but the only time available to rebuild what the day had cost. She was not unaffected. Anyone who thought the note hadn't landed, that the gear sabotage hadn't registered, that the morning's orchestrated punishment hadn't taken anything from her. Anyone who thought that had never understood what it costs a person to absorb cruelty quietly and keep moving. It cost something, it always did. But Alina Vasquez had been paying that price for a long time. And she had never once stopped moving. The briefing room of Unit 7 smelled like cold coffee and classified information. It was a windowless rectangle buried in the interior of the operations building, the kind of room designed not for comfort but for containment, where words spoken inside stayed inside and the outside world ceased to exist the moment the door sealed shut. A single long table ran down the center. Tactical maps lined one wall. A digital display screen occupied the other. The overhead lighting was fluorescent, unforgiving, and somehow always slightly too bright. Colonel Marcus Hale walked in at exactly 600 hours. Not 1 second early, not 1 second late. That was the thing about Hale that every soldier who had ever served under him remembered first: the precision. Not the decorated career, not the classified operations he had commanded across 3 continents, not the quiet authority that filled a room the moment he entered it. The precision. The sense that every action he took, from the moment he woke to the moment he closed his eyes, was deliberate, measured. The product of a man who had learned, through years of catastrophic consequence, that the difference between success and devastation often lived in the details everyone else dismissed. He was broad across the shoulders, silver at the temples, and carried himself with the particular stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove and knew it. His eyes were the color of deep water, gray-blue, steady, and difficult to read in the way that deep water is always difficult to read until you're already beneath the surface. Unit 7 came to attention with the crisp, automatic snap of soldiers who respected the man they were standing for. Hale scanned the room once, quickly, completely, the way experienced commanders scan formations, reading health and readiness and tension in a single sweep. His eyes moved across the line of men and paused briefly on Alina, not with curiosity, not with judgment, just acknowledgement, the flat, neutral acknowledgement of a commander cataloging what is in front of him before proceeding. Then he moved to the table, spread the mission files, and began without preamble. "Victor Rashev," he said, and the name landed in the room like something dropped from height. Arms dealer, Eastern European network, suspected broker for at least 3 active conflict regions. He went dark 18 months ago after a failed interdiction attempt by a NATO-aligned unit in the Balkans. 2 weeks ago, Signals Intelligence placed him at a compound in a region I am not currently authorized to name on open record. He tapped the digital display. A satellite image materialized: gray terrain, a fortified structure surrounding geography that told its own tactical story to anyone trained to read it. The intelligence window is 72 hours. After that he moves again, and the next window may not come for another year or ever. Hale's voice was even, unhurried, but carried an undercurrent of weight that every person in the room felt without being told to. This mission does not exist on any official roster. It will not be acknowledged by any command structure above this room. You go in clean. You bring Rashev out alive. You come home. He paused. Questions? It wasn't an invitation so much as a command. The kind of open floor that experienced commanders offer, not because they expect good questions, but because the questions soldiers ask reveal exactly how much they understand and exactly where the gaps are. The questions came tactical, logistical, the predictable architecture of men working through an operation they were trying to map in real time. Entry points, communications protocols, extraction timelines, rules of engagement for secondary personnel. Each question was competent. Each answer from Hale was precise and final. Then Alina spoke. She had been listening with the particular quality of attention that goes beyond concentration into something almost physical. Leaning slightly forward, eyes moving between the satellite image and the topographical overlay on the adjacent screen, cross-referencing in real time with something internal, something that lived in her body rather than just her mind. "Sir," she said, and her voice was measured and clear, carrying none of the performative confidence of someone trying to be heard, and all of the quiet authority of someone who already knows the value of what they're about to say. "If Rashev's compound sits on that grid reference, and the topography of the surrounding terrain matches the geological profile of the region I believe this is, then the eastern approach has a blind corridor that satellite imaging won't capture." Every head in the room turned toward her. Hale's eyes moved from the display to Alina without expression. She continued, "The valley formation creates a natural sound tunnel running northeast to southwest. Any team approaching from the south will break the acoustic perimeter before they reach visual range of the outer wall. Rashev's security detail will have audio detection equipment positioned along that approach. It's the standard configuration for compounds in that region with that elevation profile." She paused, just briefly. "But a two-person advance element moving from the northeast ridge, using the rock shelf as a natural sound barrier, would arrive at the outer wall without triggering a single sensor." The room was very quiet. Not the hostile quiet of earlier days in the barracks, not the performative silence of men waiting for someone to fail. This was different. This was the silence of people recalibrating, the sound of assumptions being quietly revised. Hale studied her for a moment that stretched 3 seconds longer than comfortable. His expression hadn't changed. It rarely did. But something behind his eyes had shifted in the microscopic way that only people who were watching very carefully would notice. "You've studied the region," he said. "I know the region, sir," Alina replied, simply, without elaboration. The way people speak when the statement is complete and adding to it would only diminish it. Hale held her gaze for one more beat. Then he gave a single, small nod, the kind of nod that in Hale's particular economy of expression carried more weight than most men's speeches, and returned to the briefing. Doyle sat 3 seats down from Alina and said nothing. But his jaw had tightened to the point where the muscle along his cheek was visibly working, pressing and releasing like something under pressure looking for a seam to escape through. He had walked into this briefing room expecting to watch Alina flounder in the deep water of operational planning, to give himself and the rest of the unit one more piece of evidence that she didn't belong here. Instead, she had just demonstrated, in front of Colonel Hale, in the middle of a classified mission briefing, that she understood this theater of operation better than anyone else in the room. He stared at the satellite image on the screen and said nothing for the remainder of the session. That evening, in the far corner of the barracks, away from Alina's bunk, and away from the 2 or 3 men who were beginning to show signs of independent thought, Doyle gathered his circle. His voice was low, controlled, but the control was effortful now in a way it hadn't been 2 days ago, and the men closest to him could feel the difference. "She's not one of us," he said, looking around the circle of faces slowly, making sure each man understood this was not a discussion but a position. "I don't care what she said in that briefing room. I don't care what her evaluation scores look like. She has not bled with us. She has not buried anyone with us. She is not Unit 7. He paused. "And I want her gone before we step foot on that plane." Around the circle, heads nodded, most of them, almost all of them. Martinez looked at the floor. Reyes looked at the floor. And in her bunk at the far end of the barracks, Alina lay still with her eyes open, listening to the particular quality of silence that follows a decision being made in the dark. She had heard silences like that before. She knew exactly what they meant. The morning of the pre-mission evaluation arrived cold and overcast. A low-pressure system had moved in overnight, pushing the temperature down and pulling a flat gray ceiling across the sky that made the whole base feel smaller, closer, like the world had contracted to just this compound and everything happening inside it. the kind of weather that pressed on a person's shoulders without touching them. Alina felt it the moment she stepped outside for morning formation. The air had that particular weight to it, not just meteorological but atmospheric in the human sense, the way a room feels before something important happens inside it. She had learned to read those pressures the way a pilot reads instruments, not with anxiety but with attention, noting what was coming so it didn't catch her from behind. She fell into formation and stood at ease. Doyle was already there, positioned at the front of the assembled unit with the deliberate energy of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to do. He stood with his shoulders back and his chin level, and the theatrical composure of someone who had decided that today was the day he ended this, cleanly, publicly, and permanently. Colonel Hale arrived at 6:15 hours. He took his position at the head of the formation, reviewed the unit with his standard sweep, and gave a brief acknowledgement before turning the floor over for pre-mission evaluation procedures. It was routine, standard, the kind of morning assessment that preceded any high-risk deployment, a final confirmation that every operator in the unit was physically, mentally, and tactically prepared for what was coming. What happened next was not routine. Doyle stepped forward. He moved with the slow, measured confidence of a man who believed the room was already his, who had calculated the angles, anticipated the reactions, and decided the outcome before the first word left his mouth. He addressed Colonel Hale directly, but his voice was calibrated for the entire formation. Every syllable landed with the precision of someone who understood that volume was less important than clarity when you wanted words to stick. "With respect, sir," he began, and the words "with respect" in that particular tone, in that particular context, carried precisely the opposite of their literal meaning. "I want it on official record that I have serious concerns regarding the combat readiness of Sergeant Vasquez for an operation of this sensitivity." He paused, a performer's pause, timed for effect. High-value extraction in a denied area requires proven field operators with documented combat experience in comparable theaters. It requires soldiers whose capabilities have been established through real engagement, not evaluation scores and classroom briefings. His eyes didn't move to Alina. He was too disciplined for that. But the entire formation's eyes did. "I am formally requesting that her deployment status be reviewed before we proceed." The formation was silent. Every eye in Unit 7 moved to Alina Vasquez. She stood at ease, hands clasped behind her back, feet shoulder-width apart, eyes fixed at a point on the middle distance, not at Doyle, not at Hale, not at any of the men watching her with the held-breath attention of people waiting for a reaction. She looked straight ahead at the flat gray horizon beyond the parade ground, and her face was composed with a stillness, so complete it didn't look like suppression but like genuine absence of disturbance, like a body of deep water that nothing had reached the surface of. Not a muscle moved. Not in her jaw, not around her eyes, not in the set of her shoulders or the line of her mouth. The seconds stretched. Doyle had expected something. A flash of anger, a visible effort at control, the particular tightening around the eyes that betrayed a person absorbing a blow they hadn't anticipated. He had crafted his words precisely to produce that reaction, to give Hale and the formation a picture of someone destabilized, someone whose composure was conditional rather than structural. Alina gave him nothing. The absence of reaction was more unsettling than any reaction would have been. It was the response of someone who had been hit harder than this, in worse places, by people with better aim, and had long since passed the point where this particular caliber of cruelty could find purchase. Colonel Hale let the silence hold for 3 full seconds after Doyle finished speaking. Then he said, quietly and with the absolute economy of a man who chose every word like ammunition, "The record will reflect your concern, Sergeant Doyle. The live evaluation will reflect the truth." A pause so brief it was almost surgical. Fallout. The live-fire evaluation that followed was not a formality. It was structured across 4 consecutive stations, precision marksmanship under timed conditions, close-quarters combat sequencing in a simulated hostile environment, tactical navigation through a multi-point obstacle course with live variables, and a final composite assessment combining elements of all three under cumulative physical stress. It was, by design, the kind of evaluation that stripped away everything except the irreducible truth of what a soldier was made of. There was no room for performance, no space for posturing or reputation or the borrowed authority of past deployments. Under those conditions, in that pressure, a person was exactly what they were and nothing more. Alina moved through the first station, precision marksmanship, with a quality of focus that the evaluating officer would later describe, in his written assessment, as remarkable under conditions. She shot from 3 positions across 2 distances under a timed sequence that required not just accuracy but the ability to manage breath, heart rate, and micro-movement simultaneously while a clock ran down. Her groupings were tight, consistent. The kind of consistent that doesn't come from training alone, but from the particular education that only real situations provide. Her scores were the highest in the unit. The close-quarters combat sequence was where something shifted in the watching men that hadn't shifted before. The station simulated a 2-room hostile clearance, the kind of choreographed violence that required a body to move through space with total commitment, no hesitation, no half measures. Alina moved through it the way water moves through a channel, not forcing, not performing, just finding the path of least resistance with absolute efficiency. Every movement was purposeful. Every transition was clean. She completed the sequence 14 seconds faster than the unit average. Martinez, watching from the side of the range, stopped pretending to review his own scorecard. The tactical navigation component was last, a multi-point course through simulated terrain with live decision variables introduced by the evaluating team. Wrong choices cost time. Hesitation cost more. The optimal path through the course required not just physical capability, but the kind of situational reading that separated operators from soldiers. Alina ran it without hesitation. Not recklessly, there was nothing reckless about the way she moved, but with the confident decisiveness of someone whose internal map of the environment was updating faster than the environment was changing. When it was over, she stood at the finish point breathing hard, controlled, managed, human, while the evaluating officer collected the timing sheets and handed the compiled results to Colonel Hale without comment. Hale read them, folded the paper once, placed it in his jacket pocket. He said nothing, but his eyes moved to Alina for just a moment, that same unreadable, measuring regard she had seen in the briefing room, before he turned and moved toward the medical bay to oversee pre-deployment clearances. Doyle stood at the edge of the range with his arms crossed. He said nothing either, but the set of his jaw had changed. The theatrical confidence of the morning had been replaced by something harder and quieter, the expression of a man recalculating, revising, pressing against a conclusion he didn't want to reach. Alina picked up her kit and followed the unit toward the medical bay. She didn't look at Doyle as she passed him. She didn't need to. The evaluation had already said everything that needed saying, not to him, not to the unit, not to Colonel Hale, to herself, in the private language of performance under pressure, in the only conversation that had ever mattered to her. She was ready. She had always been ready. What happened next in the medical bay, in the quiet routine of a pre-deployment check, none of them were ready for. The medical bay at Fort Bragg was the kind of room that made everyone equal. It didn't matter what rank you carried through the door, what decorations lined your service record, or what reputation preceded you down the corridors of the operations building. In the medical bay, you were a body assessed, measured, cleared, or not cleared, reduced to the fundamental biological question of whether you were capable of surviving what was being asked of you. Rank sat outside. The body came in alone. The pre-deployment medical evaluation was standard procedure: blood pressure, cardiac assessment, musculoskeletal screening, a spinal examination that had been added to Unit 7's protocol after 2 operators had deployed with undiagnosed compression injuries and come home in worse condition than they'd left. It was thorough, unhurried, and conducted with the particular clinical efficiency of a military physician who had performed the same sequence hundreds of times and had long since stopped seeing it as anything other than mechanics. The unit moved through in rotation. Nobody lingered. Nobody complained. Soldiers endured medical evaluations the way they endured most institutional discomforts, with the flat patience of people who understood that some things simply had to be gotten through. Alina was fourth in the rotation. She entered the bay, acknowledged the physician with a nod, and moved through the initial assessments without incident. Blood pressure steady. Cardiac rhythm clean. The physician noted her resting heart rate with a slight elevation of his eyebrows. It was lower than most of the men he'd processed that morning, which was either a genetic gift or evidence of a conditioning history that went well beyond standard military fitness requirements. He made a note and moved to the spinal assessment. "Jacket off, please, Sergeant." Alina reached up, unzipped her jacket, and shrugged it from her shoulders in one smooth motion. She turned her back to the physician. And the room, the medical bay of Unit 7, which had processed hundreds of soldiers across dozens of deployments and had seen approximately everything the human body was capable of producing, enduring, and surviving, went completely, absolutely, devastatingly silent. Not immediately. There was a fraction of a second, a thin sliver of time between the moment Alina's jacket came off and the moment the room understood what it was seeing, where everything was still normal, where the physician was simply preparing to begin a spinal assessment on a pre-deployment soldier, and the 2 unit members present for their own clearances were simply waiting their turn. And then the fraction of a second ended. The physician's hands, raised and prepared to begin the assessment, stopped moving. One of the 2 soldiers behind Alina, Reyes, young and generally quiet, a man not given to dramatic reactions, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. A small, involuntary exhalation of breath that carried in it the compressed weight of complete surprise. The other soldier said nothing, he simply stared. Because running the full length of Alina Vasquez's spine, from the base of her neck, where the first cervical vertebra met the skull, all the way down to the small of her back, where the spine curved inward toward the hips, was a tattoo that belonged to a different category entirely from anything decorative, personal, or commemorative in the ordinary sense. It was architectural. That was the only word for it. Precise and structured in a way that suggested it had been designed with the same deliberate intentionality that goes into the construction of something meant to last, something meant to carry weight permanently, visibly, without apology. At the top, centered perfectly between her shoulder blades, was an insignia. A wreath, rendered in clean dark lines, encircling a downward-facing dagger, and at the center of the wreath, positioned over the blade of the dagger like a point of orientation on a compass, a single black star. Reyes recognized it first. He was young, but he had grown up in a military family, had spent his childhood absorbing the mythology of special operations the way other children absorbed sports statistics. And he had heard the insignia described once, in a whispered conversation between his father and a man whose name he was never told, as the mark of a unit so classified that acknowledging its existence in the wrong company could end a career before the sentence finished. Ghost Recon Black Cell. Tier 1. Deep Black. The kind of classified that didn't appear on any official organizational chart, that existed in the operational architecture of the U.S. military, the way a load-bearing wall exists in a building, essential, structural, and completely invisible behind the surface. Most career officers had heard of it only as rumor, the kind of rumor that circulates in the specific register of things that are true but cannot be confirmed, that everyone with sufficient clearance knows exists, and no one with sufficient clearance will discuss. A unit that operated in the spaces between acknowledged operations, in the geography of deniability, in the hours before dawn in countries whose names never appeared in after-action reports. Running down Alina's spine on both sides of the insignia, in two parallel vertical columns of names etched in clean, unadorned lettering, first names only, no ranks, no surnames, just the names themselves stripped of everything institutional and reduced to the essential human fact of identity, were 12 names. 12. Each one precise, each one permanent, each one carrying the particular gravity of names that are placed not for decoration, but for witness. Names written on a body the way names are carved into stone, because the person carrying them has decided that forgetting is not something she is willing to do, and that the closest she can come to keeping the dead present is to make them part of the living architecture of her own body. And at the base of the tattoo, following the natural curve of the lumbar spine in small, precise Latin script, a single line. They carried the dark so others kept the light. Colonel Marcus Hale entered the medical bay at that moment. He came through the side door with a pre-deployment clearance file in his left hand, reading as he walked, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a man working through a checklist. He crossed 3 steps into the room before some peripheral register of the quality of silence, the specific stillness of 3 people who had stopped moving, pulled his eyes up from the file. He looked toward the examination table. He saw Alina's back. His hand lowered the file. Slowly, without intention, the way a person's body responds to shock before the mind has finished processing what the eyes have delivered, automatic, gravitational, pulled downward by the weight of recognition. His eyes moved to the insignia first. He knew it. Of course he knew it. He had authorized its use. He had sat in the classified briefing where its design was finalized, had signed the operational charter that brought Black Cell into existence as a functioning unit, had shaken the hands of the men who would carry it into the field. Then his eyes moved to the names. One by one, reading down the left column, then the right. And with each name, something happened to his face that the people in that room had never seen happen to Colonel Marcus Hale's face before, something that moved beneath the surface of his composure like a current beneath ice, not breaking through but visibly present, visibly pressuring from underneath. He knew every name. Every single one. Because 6 years ago, in a classified operations center 3 time zones away, he had been the voice in their earpieces. He had been the commander who sent them in. He had been the one who lost comms 40 minutes after insertion and spent the next 72 hours trying to understand what had happened in a region that officially didn't exist, to a unit that officially had never been deployed. He had read the report that called it a training accident. He had never believed it. And now he was standing in a medical bay at Fort Bragg, reading their names on the spine of a woman who had been in that room with them, who had survived what they hadn't, who had carried them, literally and permanently, on her body ever since. The file in his hand fell to his side completely. The room held its breath. And Colonel Marcus Hale, a man who had commanded operations across 3 continents, who had stood in burning buildings and collapsing structures, and the absolute geography of catastrophe without breaking composure, stood completely, utterly still. And stared. Hale closed the medical bay door behind him with the quiet deliberateness of a man who understood that what was about to happen in this room needed walls around it. Not for security, not for protocol, for something older and less institutional than either of those things. The kind of privacy that certain conversations require not because they contain classified information, but because they contain truth, and truth of a particular weight needs a contained space, or it spreads in directions nobody can control. He dismissed the physician with a look. The man gathered his clipboard and left without a word, with the practiced discretion of someone who had spent enough years in military medicine to recognize the moments that were above his clearance level without needing to be told. Reyes and the other soldier followed without being asked. The door closed. Alina had put her jacket back on. She stood facing the examination table with her back to the room, and for a moment, just a moment, she didn't turn around. She stood still, her hands resting flat on the edge of the table, and breathed. Once. Twice. The controlled, deliberate breathing of someone managing something internal that required management before it could be faced externally. Then she turned. Hale was standing 6 feet away. He had set the clearance file on the counter beside the door and hadn't picked it up again. He stood with his hands at his sides, not clasped behind his back, not crossed over his chest, not arranged in any of the postures of authority or assessment that defined his presence in every other room he occupied, just at his sides, open. The posture, Alina noted in the part of her mind that never stopped reading rooms, of a man who had set down his rank for a moment, and was standing in front of her as something simpler and more exposed than a colonel. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice was quiet, not hushed in the way of secrecy, but quiet in the way of care. The way a person speaks when they are holding something fragile and know it. "Black Cell," he said, "Operation Hollow Ash." He let the words exist in the room between them. Not a question, not an accusation, just a nomming, the way you name something you have been unable to name for a very long time, and the act of nomming it is itself a kind of release. Alina met his eyes steadily. "Yes, sir." Hale exhaled, a single, slow breath that carried in it something she recognized as the particular weight of a person who has been holding something in their chest for years and has just been given, for the first time, permission to set it down. He moved to the counter, placed both hands flat on its surface, and looked at the wall for a moment before turning back to her. That mission was buried within 30 days of the comms blackout. Every file, every operational record, every personnel assignment. The official report classified it as a training exercise casualty event and closed the investigation before any independent review was possible. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I spent 14 months trying to access the full after-action record through legitimate channels. Every request was redirected, reclassified, or simply not answered." He paused. "I was eventually advised by someone above my pay grade to stop asking." Alina said nothing. She watched him with the steady attention of someone who has waited a long time for a conversation and is in no hurry now that it has arrived. "I never stopped believing something went wrong before insertion," Hale continued. "The timing of the comms blackout was too precise, too immediate. 40 minutes after you hit the ground, that's not equipment failure. That's not environmental interference." His eyes found hers. "Someone knew you were coming." "Yes, sir," Alina said again, quietly, flatly. The flatness not of indifference but of a person who has lived with a truth so long it has lost the ability to shock her even when spoken aloud by someone else for the first time. Hale straightened. "Tell me what happened after comms went dark." Alina was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, processing, deciding not whether to tell him but how to tell him, how to translate something that lived in her body as physical memory into the linear architecture of language without losing what was essential about it. "We took fire 4 minutes after insertion," she began. "It came from the northeast ridge, the approach corridor I identified in yesterday's briefing. Someone had repositioned a secondary unit there within the 6-hour window between our final intelligence update and boots on ground." She paused. "Which means the updated positioning data was fed to the opposing force after our last confirmed intelligence cycle. The leak was inside the planning chain." Hale's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes pressed forward with the focused intensity of a man hearing confirmation of something he has suspected for 6 years. "The first exchange lasted approximately 8 minutes, Alina continued. "We lost 2 operators in the initial contact, Graves and Holloway. Her voice remained even, not because the names didn't cost her anything, but because she had learned in the years since to carry them without letting the carrying show in her voice. The remaining 10 pulled back to the secondary rally point under fire. We held there for 40 minutes. Then the secondary position was hit. A pause. Coordinated. They knew the rally point coordinates. Her eyes didn't waver. Someone gave them our full operational package, sir. Insertion point, rally points, extraction corridor, timeline, all of it. The room was very still. How many made it past the secondary position? Hale asked, though something in the way he asked it suggested he was bracing for the answer rather than waiting for it. 4, Alina said, for approximately 40 minutes. She let that sit. Then 3, then 2, then 1. The last word landed in the room like something irreversible. Hale looked at her directly. You carried them. I tried to, sir. Sinclair made it 2 miles before. She stopped. Started again. I carried what I could for as long as I could. The last of them died in my arms approximately 3 hours after the secondary position fell. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture, dense, weighted, filled with the specific gravity of things that cannot be unsaid or unheard. The report said there were no survivors, Hale said, and his voice had changed in a way that was difficult to define, quieter, rougher, like something had shifted in the mechanism that produced it. The report was written by people who needed there to be no survivors, Alina replied, not with bitterness, not with anger, with the clean, unadorned precision of a statement of fact, the way a person speaks about something they have already processed completely, already made peace with, already folded into the structure of who they are without letting it become the whole of it. A civilian aid worker extracted me 12 hours later, 20 miles from the original insertion point. I was in a deteriorated physical condition but functional. She paused. I was taken to a black site medical facility, stabilized, debriefed by 2 individuals who did not provide names or affiliations, and then advised clearly and specifically that discussing Operation Hollow Ash in any context, with any person, under any circumstances, constituted a federal security violation carrying criminal consequences. Hale closed his eyes briefly. It was the most unguarded thing Alina had ever seen him do. My record was restructured, she continued. New designation, new assignment history, new unit placement trail. I was told to start over quietly, completely, and without looking back. Hale opened his eyes, and you just kept serving. Alina looked at him for a moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried something different, not harder, not softer, but deeper, like a note struck on an instrument with more resonance than the ones surrounding it. Those men died serving, sir, she said. Every one of them. They didn't choose the outcome, they chose the commitment. Stopping felt like a betrayal of the only thing I had left of them. A pause so brief it was almost not there, so I kept going. Hale looked at her for a long time. The clearance file sat untouched on the counter beside the door. Outside, somewhere in the operations building, the sounds of a base preparing for deployment moved through the walls, boots on concrete, equipment being checked, voices running through final confirmations. Inside the medical bay, Colonel Marcus Hale stood across from Staff Sergeant Alina Vasquez and said 2 words. Thank you, Sergeant. He said them quietly, without performance, without the institutional framing of a superior addressing a subordinate. Just 2 words, spoken by a man to a soldier who had carried something for 6 years in complete silence and had never once asked anyone to notice. It was the first time anyone in that building had thanked her for anything. Alina held his gaze for 1 moment longer. Then she gave a single, small nod, the kind that accepts acknowledgement without requiring it, and straightened her jacket. The names on her spine rested quietly beneath the fabric. Still carried, still present, still waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to what she had already known for 6 years. They lifted off at 200 hours under a sky with no moon and no mercy. The transport aircraft climbed hard through the darkness, banking east over the Atlantic with the kind of purposeful urgency that reminded every soldier in the hold that what waited at the other end of this flight was not a training exercise, not a simulation, not the controlled discomfort of an evaluation course. It was real. It was live, and it would not adjust itself to accommodate their limitations or their fears. The hold was dim, red-lit, the way military transports are always red-lit before an operation, the color chosen because it preserves night vision and costs nothing emotionally, though Alina had always thought there was something unintentionally honest about it. Red light before combat, the color of what was coming, rendered in the atmosphere before anyone had to say it aloud. Unit 7 sat in 2 rows facing each other across the narrow center aisle. Nobody spoke much. That was normal, the particular silence of soldiers in the final hours before insertion, when the mission has been briefed and rebriefed, and the gear has been checked and rechecked, and there is nothing left to do but sit with what is coming and make whatever internal peace is available. Some men closed their eyes. Some stared at their boots. Martinez ran through his insertion sequence in his head, with the focused internal repetition of a man reciting a prayer he had learned to believe in through evidence rather than faith. Doyle sat at the far end of the row with his elbow on his knee, and his jaw set in the expression of a man who had made a decision he hadn't fully reconciled with yet. The reckoning from the barracks still sitting somewhere behind his eyes, unresolved but present, like a stone in a boot he hadn't yet stopped to remove. Alina sat opposite him and looked at nothing in particular. She was ready. She had been ready since before she boarded the plane, since before the reckoning in the barracks, since before the medical bay and the briefing room, and the first morning she had walked through the steel doors of Unit 7 carrying one bag, and a history she wasn't authorized to explain. She was always ready. That was the thing nobody in this unit had understood about her from the beginning, not because they lacked intelligence but because they lacked context. Readiness, for Alina Vasquez, was not a state she achieved through preparation. It was a state she inhabited permanently, continuously, because the alternative had been taken from her 6 years ago in a dark valley in a country that officially didn't exist, and she had decided somewhere in those 12 hours of surviving alone that she would never again be caught unprepared for anything the world chose to deliver. The insertion went clean. They hit the ground 8 kilometers from the compound at 3:40 hours local time, moved through the darkness in 2-element formations, and covered the initial approach without contact. The night was cold and still, the terrain exactly as the satellite imaging had described it, rocky, uneven, demanding in the particular way of landscapes that don't accommodate mistakes. Alina led the advance element with rays, moving northeast along the ridge approach she had identified in the briefing room, the corridor that the room had gone quiet for, the path that existed in her knowledge of this region, the way certain things exist in a person's knowledge, not as information retrieved but as territory remembered. She moved through it with the confidence of someone returning to a place they have never left entirely. The outer wall of the compound appeared through the darkness at 4:12 hours. No sensor triggers, no perimeter alerts, no security sweep catching them in its arc. Exactly as she had said it would be. Reyes glanced at her from 2 meters to her left. She didn't acknowledge it. She was already reading the next 50 meters of approach, already calculating the entry sequence, already 3 decisions ahead of the present moment in the way that experience teaches a mind to move when the cost of falling behind is measured in lives. The first 2 hours of the operation went exactly according to the plan. Then everything fell apart. It happened the way things only fall apart in real operations, not with warning, not with the clean, dramatic escalation of a training scenario where variables are introduced at manageable intervals. It happened all at once, from multiple directions, with the overwhelming simultaneity of a situation that has been allowed to develop beyond the point of elegant response. Rashev's compound had been reinforced since the last satellite pass. A secondary unit, 12 personnel, heavily armed, positioned in the interior courtyard, had moved in within the previous 18 hours, after the intelligence window had closed and after Unit 7 was already in the air. The outer extraction route was blocked by a vehicle patrol that shouldn't have existed according to any intelligence they had been given. The operation fractured at 5:10 hours. What was supposed to be a clean four-man extraction from the primary building became a firefight in a dark interior corridor with limited visibility, compromised communications, and a closing window of survivability that every operator in the unit could feel contracting around them like a physical thing. 2 men went down in the first exchange, non-fatal wounds, but wounds that required immediate management and removed them from effective action. The primary extraction route was cut. The secondary route was under watch. The compound's interior security had been alerted and was moving to consolidate. Doyle took a round to the left shoulder in the second exchange. It hit him while he was covering a doorway, spun him back against the wall, and dropped him to one knee with the hard finality of physics applied to tissue and bone. He stayed up because Doyle was the kind of man whose body required explicit instructions to go down, and his mind never gave them. But his left arm was compromised, his weapon handling reduced to one-hand operation, and the blood coming through his sleeve was moving at a rate that told its own story about time remaining. He looked up. Alina was already there. She hadn't been beside him a second ago. She had been 12 feet away, covering the opposite approach. And then she was beside him, moving with the fluid decisiveness of someone whose response to crisis isn't triggered by thought but by something older and faster than thought. She came down to one knee beside him, her own weapon up and covering the corridor over his shoulder, while her other hand found his wound with the trained precision of a combat medic who had dressed injuries in conditions that made this corridor look manageable. She packed the wound, applied pressure, secured the dressing with the efficient economy of movement that comes from having done this before in worse places with worse outcomes, and having learned that speed and calmness are not opposites but partners, that the fastest hands in a trauma situation are always the calmest ones. Doyle said nothing. He watched her work on him with an expression that was impossible to read fully in the darkness of the corridor, something complicated moving through it, something that had been building since the barracks reckoning and hadn't finished arriving yet. She finished the dressing, met his eyes for exactly 1 second, and was back in motion. She navigated them out through the northeast ridge. The same approach, the same corridor, the sound tunnel that satellite imaging couldn't capture, the rock shelf that absorbed noise and movement and delivered them silently through the chaos to the other side of it. She moved them through in sequence, covering, moving, covering again, calling each transition with the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly where they are going and exactly how to get there, and has never once doubted either. One by one, Unit 7 cleared the ridge. When the last man stepped through and the extraction bird appeared in the clearing below, rotors low and fast and beautiful in the gray pre-dawn light, Alina counted the unit. 12 men, every one of them breathing. She was the last one onto the bird. Nobody spoke on the flight back. The hold was red-lit again, and the unit sat in it with the particular exhaustion of people who have survived something they weren't certain they would survive and haven't yet fully processed the distance between the two outcomes. Wounds were managed. Equipment was secured. Eyes were closed or open or fixed on the middle distance, each man somewhere private, somewhere interior, doing whatever it is soldiers do in the first quiet hours after the noise stops. Doyle sat across from Alina. At some point during the flight, somewhere over dark water, somewhere between what had happened and what came next, he looked at her directly. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then, slowly and deliberately, he gave a single nod. not the performative nod of social acknowledgement, not the tight, reluctant nod of a man conceding a point he resents conceding. Something different, something lower, something that came from a different place entirely. The nod of a man acknowledging a debt. The nod of a soldier recognizing another soldier in the complete and unconditional way that has nothing to do with rank or gender or the opinions he walked into a barracks with 7 days ago. Elena received it with a small, quiet nod of her own. Then she looked forward again. They landed back at Fort Bragg in the pale, uncertain light of early morning, that particular hour when the night hasn't fully released its grip and the day hasn't fully committed to arriving, when the base is quiet in the way that only very early mornings and very late nights produce. The kind of quiet that feels earned. They walked off the bird one by one onto the tarmac, moving with the careful deliberateness of people whose bodies have been asked a great deal, and are communicating the cost in the particular language of exhaustion that only soldiers and first responders and emergency physicians know fluently. No ceremony, no assembled formation waiting to receive them, no flags or speeches or formal acknowledgement of what they had done in a place that officially didn't exist. Just soldiers walking off a plane in the early morning quiet. Elena was among the first onto the tarmac. She shouldered her bag, checked her weapon with the automatic habit of someone who had been checking weapons her entire adult life, and walked toward the barracks through the pale morning light. Behind her, she heard the unit dispersing, quiet voices, slow boots on concrete, the sounds of people returning to the ordinary world from somewhere far outside its edges. Nobody called after her. They didn't need to. She walked across the empty base in the growing light. This woman they had tried to break, who had not broken, who had never been going to break, with the same steady, unhurried step she had carried through every hard thing that had come before this one, and every hard thing that would come after it. Somewhere beneath her jacket, 12 names rested quietly against her spine. Still carried, still honored. Still keeping the dark at bay.